Good morning. I'm glad to be here. This session is fund development in an election year and a pandemic, a double pandemic. So we're going to talk a little bit about the state of fundraising and fund development and some things that you can consider going into both your year-end fundraising and what fund development could or should look like in the coming years. So my name is Rachel D'Souza Siebert. I'm the founder and principal of Gladiator Consulting. I am a mom and a wife. You can see my family there. I founded Gladiator about 5 years ago, so I'm happy to celebrate my team, and we're really glad to be supporting STEM STL today with this event. I am also a lover of philanthropy. I am a daughter of South Asian immigrants. I have children who are half Indian, so I'm very excited to have a vice president who is half Indian. I am a heart attack survivor. I am a lifelong St. Louisan, and I am excited again to be here today. So we are going to start with a quick history lesson because we need to understand the system in which we are a part of to be able to understand how we can raise more funds and support for our various organizations. So I always like to start in this place, the history of philanthropy in the United States. So I think we all know that generally at its roots, philanthropy means the love of humankind. And the term philanthropy in the United States over the course of time was sort of co-opted, right, by individuals who were considered people at the time of that co-opting. So, you know, back at the origins of colonization in this country, we had indigenous folks that lived here, and philanthropy for them looked like the sharing of resources, right? So it looked like sharing meals, sharing healthcare, sharing childcare, making sure that everybody had what they needed. We saw that showing up in religious traditions, and as waves of colonizers and immigrants began to come to this country, we saw those patterns of sort of sharing resources to make sure that everyone had what they needed be perpetuated. So then we get to the late 1800s, early 1900s, and we begin to see individuals who are considered people. So for the purpose of that, we'll talk about white, Christian, land-owning men started to build up a lot of financial wealth through the Industrial Revolution and through sort of the growth of industry. And we have our friend here in the bottom right corner, Andrew Carnegie, who wrote a letter, narrative, an essay called The Gospel of Wealth. And I will let you Google The Gospel of Wealth. But this document has essentially set the tone for philanthropy in the 1900s and obviously in this century as well. And that was essentially that the meaning of philanthropy really pivoted from its root meaning of love of humankind to really being a little bit more about wealthy people or people who had amassed wealth being able to distribute that wealth throughout their community. And I want to be really clear about something when we think about the system, right? So when we look at the roots of philanthropic tradition, the sharing of resources, that was really about what people needed, right? Children needed access to school, or children needed access to healthcare, or, the elderly needed access to something. When we start to look at philanthropy in the 20th century, in the 21st century, we really start to see a shift in that resources are being shared in the way that the donor wants to share them. So one of the things that always stands out to me here is, I think about Andrew Carnegie. I think about him, making his wealth during the Industrial Revolution. And he created and really drove forward a lot of the environmental crisis that we are thinking about and grappling with today. But the majority of his philanthropy really went to support causes that he was extremely passionate about, namely, the library system in the United States. And so we do have Andrew Carnegie to thank for, the amount of libraries and the network of libraries that we have across the country, but in helping to address perhaps one need in our community, we ignore the fact that he has also caused or been part of a cause of a problem that we also grapple with today that does not have a lot of philanthropic support from those who made funds off of, creating the problem. So I just want to center that there. So as we move forward in history, we see, a few shifts. In addition to, the Civil Rights Act and other acts that started to bring about practices of equality across our country, we also see the Revenue Act of 1954 and 1969. And so those acts really created the tax structure in which nonprofits as we know them function. We have the civil rights movement. We start to, as a country, embrace this idea of trickle-down economics, in that if somehow we have smaller government, that individual actors in society, non-governmental organizations, nonprofit organizations will essentially form the safety net. And so from the beginning of essentially the 1980s through now, we've seen that happening. We know we have, I think it's something wild, like upwards of 13,000 nonprofit organizations active in the state. They're all charged with their own missions that are all doing their own things. So our gentleman on the right is a guy named Darren Walker, who is the current CEO of the Ford Foundation. A few years ago, he authored a document called Towards a New Gospel of Wealth. And in this document, again, Google is your friend, so feel free to go there. What he really states is that, philanthropy is not enough, that we have to figure out how to use our resources to change the broken systems that aren't working for everybody, and to figure out how do we get back to that space in philanthropy where we are expressing a love of humankind. So we know that over the course of the last few years, the way that we think about money and resources has also changed. And so we know that when we had back in 2017, there were a lot of things that happened and people got very scared. And so those who typically would itemize their taxes started to figure out how to be able to disperse money or to share money with nonprofits and also relieve their tax burden. So what we started to see in 2018, at the end of 2017 and 2018, was a reduction in small or mid-sized gifts made directly to nonprofit organizations, because those funds were put in a donor-advised fund. Another thing for you to Google. But essentially, a donor-advised fund is a fund that can be managed by a for-profit or nonprofit entity. When a donor puts money into a donor-advised fund, at the time of that contribution, the donor receives their tax letter. But at that point, they are not required to disperse a specific amount of funds from that donor-advised fund ever. So I could be a person who put $1 million into a donor-advised fund back in 2017. I would have gotten a letter from that entity letting me know that I have $1 million charitable tax deduction to make, and I don't actually have to disperse money from that donor advised fund to an active 501(c)(3) at all. So we also saw promises of increased corporate giving that didn't really actualize itself until a few years later. And we also saw an increase in foundation disbursements. So when we go back to 2018 and we look at that giving, Giving USA is a really great place to get a comprehensive look at giving across the United States. And you can drill down into different interest areas as well. what we saw is, as we knew, giving by individuals, it dropped a little bit. We saw giving by foundations essentially go up a nice percentage. Giving by bequests was the same, which, just to be clear, a bequest is a gift that is made at the time of death. So we would anticipate that bequest giving would generally stay the same. People are generally dying at the same rate. People are generally putting the same amount of money into bequest holdings and trusts. And we saw corporate giving go up a little bit. So in 2019, we had some increases. We had charitable giving increase in 2019 by about 4.2%. I want to be extremely clear that when I say this, the biggest recipient of charitable gifts in 2019 was a donor advised fund. So it was like Fidelity's donor advised fund was the recipient of that. Whether or not Fidelity has turned around and encouraged its donors to disperse those funds directly to 501c3s is a whole nother story. So we saw the economy, or perhaps a Trump bump. A Trump bump is when things are so bad that we give money to an organization we care about. We saw individual giving raise a little bit again. Bequests stay flat. Giving to corporations increased a bit, and giving by foundations also increased a little bit. So we were on the upswing. We wrapped our heads around what the tax code, had looked like back in 2017, and we were starting to figure things out. And then we get to 2020, and I think the biggest lesson that we have to, really sit with this year is that everyone is affected by what's going on. When we think about crisis giving, when we think about hurricanes or tsunamis or wildfires, we typically find ourselves organizing around a specific incident in a specific place that's impacting specific people. And this dual pandemic, both living in the time of, coronavirus and COVID-19, as well as a resurgence and very, public killings of Black lives and the Black Lives Matter movement, we're all affected by that. And so crisis giving looks a little bit different this year. We know, obviously, that event revenue is taking huge hits. People aren't having events. They are having virtual events. They are maybe trying hybrid events. Donor advised funds continue to be on the rise. We are still looking at a world in which the number one recipient of charitable funds in 2020 is going to be a donor advised fund. We have started to see mega wealthy, high net worth folks dispersing huge amounts of money into communities. And I think, where I want you to sit with this is a lot of giving this year is reactive. It is directly reactive to the circumstances that people are finding themselves in, the things that we're hearing about. And we also know that corporations are trying to figure out where they fit in all of this. We have corporations even here in St. Louis who have had to lay off huge amounts of their workforce this year, and are expected to continue to provide charitable support to organizations that they have relationships with across the community. So I think the thing that I would, really center is this term VUCA. Another thing to Google, but the Harvard Business Review published an article about VUCA a few years ago, and essentially said, for some time now, the world that we live in is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. What we think we know is true is not true. Things that used to work aren't working anymore. We have to move faster and be a little bit more resilient with our resources. And so with that, we've also seen a shift in the way that people think about their resources. And so now I do want to spend a little bit of time talking through some fundraising models and talking about some ideas and ways that you guys can connect with your donors throughout the end of the year and going into the next year. I do want to pause and see if I have any questions, and I don't think I do. And if I do, I apologize if I'm moving too quickly. Okay, so if you are a development person, if you are in the fundraising, nonprofit fundraising world, you know about donor-centered fundraising, right? We know about Penelope Burke. We read her donor-centered fundraising book. It is an integrated and collaborative model to raise money that inspires donors to remain loyal longer and give more generously sooner. This has been the prevailing practice in nonprofit organizations. And essentially, the way that it shows up, I think, for nonprofit staff is if you are able to connect with your donor and encourage them to give in a way that makes them feel good, that makes their contribution feel valued, they will continue to support your organization. And so that has really been, I think, the way that fundraising staff has been brought up in nonprofit land. So over the course, I would say, of the last 3 or 4 years, we've started to see something new happening, and that is the community-centric fundraising movement. And I want to be really clear to use the term movement here because it's more than a practice, right? When we think about donor-centered fundraising, it is a little bit more transactional. It is about a relationship between the fundraiser and a donor. It's about a relationship between, the institution and the donor. When we think about community-centric fundraising, we are talking about being a part of a movement that is not only trying to transform the way that we think about resources in our sector, but the systems in which we function. Are the systems in which we function fair? Are they doing what they need to do for people? And so you can visit the Community-Centric Fundraising website. It's a movement that's been around since, I think, 2017, but really sort of launched and went public this past July. And it's based on a blog post by Asian American Pacific Islander gentleman who lives in Seattle named Vu Lei, who has a blog called Nonprofit AF. You know what the AF stands for. But a few years ago, he published the 9 principles of community-centric fundraising. And since then, we've grown to 10. And the 10th one is that we recognize that healing and liberation requires a commitment to economic justice. So I'm not going to read these principles to you, but this is generally what the foundations are of this work. And what it means to bring justice and equity to your fundraising practice. What are the things that we need to adopt and integrate into our development plan, into our solicitations, into the way we communicate with donors, into our relationships with grant makers? And it is possible, I promise. So the goal of community-centric fundraising, I know you've probably seen this pop up everywhere. The goal is liberation, but I always want to ask people, what is the 4th box? We have 3 boxes, in the 3rd box, liberation means that the barrier, right, has been taken down. But what comes next? Sometimes we talk about belonging. Sometimes we talk about justice. Sometimes justice is tied up in liberation. I like to joke around that when we get to the 4th box, we're not having to watch baseball. And if you're like me, we're probably, scrolling Instagram instead. But what is that next piece? And I think that's a little bit different, right? Because when we think about donor-centered fundraising, at the end of the day, we are still thinking about bringing resources into our organization to achieve a goal. When we think about community-centric fundraising, we are thinking about a time and space where our organization is actually not needed anymore because we have solved a problem. And that really actually does make my head explode a little bit. And we're not there yet, right? This takes a long time. So I want to be clear that just because we advocate for a community-centric fundraising movement doesn't mean that we throw out donor-centered fundraising. There are relationship tenets in donor-centered fundraising that are really important to how we evolve the conversations that our organizations are having with funders. And we never want to just stop doing what we've been doing, but we do want to find ways to make it more effective and more resilient, in moments of crisis, in times where we need to think about our resources differently. And so I would encourage you to keep, a practice of donor-centered fundraising at the core of your development plan, right? We want to have strong transformational relationships with people who provide gifts of time, in-kind gifts, gifts of money to our organization. But we also want to figure out how to get at the problem we're trying to solve in a deeper way. And so usually when I talk about this, people are like, all of this is really great, but my organization still needs to raise money. So what am I encouraging you to do? So I want us to think about some specific segments of our donors. So the Indiana University School of Philanthropy released a really exciting study. I thought it was really exciting. Let me be clear. I really geek out on some of this data stuff. But they released a really exciting study about women and giving. And what we know is that women, their wealth and their influence is growing. And that is happening in two ways. It is happening through inheritance. So, if you are a fundraiser forever and ever, we've heard about this wealth transfer that over the course of I think we're in the middle of a 20 to 30 year wealth transfer from generation to generation, that women are the ones that are actually receiving the inheritance. The other thing that we're starting to see is entrepreneurship, that women are starting their own businesses and building their own wealth. And I find this really interesting because there isn't, it's not happening in relationship to being in a marriage, being a parent, being in sort of these other roles. We also know that women give more and that they are motivated by empathy, they are responsive, and they're excited about having a relationship. When Indiana University did the study and polled men, what men really shared was they were motivated more so by federated giving. So if I give through my employer, if I give to a United Way campaign, by the tax benefits, and by sort of the self-interest, is my name on the building? Do I get a brick? Are they naming the hospital wing after me? And this actually, I wonder a lot about this, how relevant this is. And I also realized that when we think about how the IRS built tax structures for nonprofits and for people who give to nonprofits, some of the things that men talk about that drive them, that drive their giving, are reasons why those laws were made. And so historically, this does make sense to me. Does this mean that all women are empathetic? Does this mean that all men are self-interested? No, it absolutely does not. There are many reasons why people give, and the only way that you will know that is if you have a relationship with your donors. But it's an interesting trend to consider. So if you don't have a very specific part of your development plan that is cultivating new relationships with your female donors, you should. That should be part of your 2021, 2022 giving strategy. How are we building stronger relationships with our female donors? The other thing that I would encourage you to think about when we think about channels is what we know about generations in giving. And generally speaking, in St. Louis, we have spent a lot of time over, I would say probably the last few decades, focusing our time and attention on boomers and the silent generation. And part of that is because we've all seen that, that pyramid of giving, where it talks about moving people up the pyramid from an annual gift to a major gift to a planned gift. And generally, right, that happens over a lifetime. So we built relationships with younger boomers, and we've continued to move them through that timeline because ultimately we were told that we want to get those boomer and silent generation donors to a sort of pinnacle, mega gift, end of life gift, right? In doing that, we forgot to sort of build relationships with our Gen X donors, our millennial donors, and our Gen Z donors. And they expect some different things than our boomers and our silent generation who are in a different period of their life. So I would encourage you to have focus groups. They're super easy these days if you do them virtual. You let people know that you are going to have a focus group on one of these days. They get to sign up. And you think about the questions that you want to ask them, like, why do you care about my organization? Why have you given to my organization in the past? Was it because we asked you? Was it because you were reacting to a need? Do you have a friend that's involved? What are some things that would make you more likely to get involved with our organization? And we know that, especially when we look at millennials, so let's say the 40 and under crowd, people don't just want to write a check to you. They want to phone bank for your cause. They want to participate in some sort of community-centered event. They want to get to know the people that they're supporting. They may want to participate in a mutual aid effort. They want to see the overlap in the organizations that they are involved with. There was a organization here that did a fundraiser for their organization that was a farm to table dinner, but they purchased all of their dinner courses from a sustainable farming initiative that was working within sort of the confines of racial and economic justice as it relates to the environment, right? So we're starting to see this overlap. Like, we don't want you to be in a silo. We want you to tell us all of the ways in which you have relationships that are creating change, right, in our community. The other thing that I would say about Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z is that we have some of these folks who are in this interesting sandwich generation, right? So they are supporting their aging parents. They are also raising children. And one of the things that I continue to hear over and over and over again is that the likelihood that a millennial is going to give money to your organization depends on whether or not you offer childcare when you ask them to volunteer. So, like, tattoo that on your arm, write it on the mirror so you see it every day. If we want to build successful fundraising strategies long-term with our millennial donors, we need to figure out how to give them space to show up as all of themselves, right? So a few things about our people of color, and I put people of color in parentheses because that's not a real group. We cannot lump non-white people into one category and expect that they are going to follow patterns. What I will say is that when we look at people of color, specifically Black families that are amassing wealth, these things are true. So we see that people of color donors, especially Black donors, live in cross-class families and communities. So there is more generational growth that is happening over the course of time. We also see that because there is a racialized wealth gap, children are always encouraged to grow up and out, right, of the community. We also see some generational differences among high net worth donors of color, and I would point you in the direction, again, I hate these terms, we talk about Latinx, Latino, Hispanic donors. There's lots of ethnic labels you can put on these folks, but look at Florida and look at Arizona, right? You have a community of older high net worth donors of color that have very different interests of where they want to put their charitable dollars than younger, the next generation communities of color in Arizona. The other thing that I would say is when we think about people of color and giving, we have a racialized history in this country. So at the end of the day, when we look at who holds the majority of the wealth is still with white Christian families that are typically in a man-woman partnership. So while I want you to obviously build relationships with your non-white donors, I want you to be really clear that the amount of wealth that has been amassed in these communities and with these families and individuals is nowhere near close to what your white donor base looks like. And that's just a fact, okay? So I just want you to know this, like, if you look at your donors and 90% of your donors are white, that is true. Does not make you specifically like a racist or biased organization. It means that you have been getting money from the people who have the money. I want you to know that. You can't feel guilty about it. It's true. It requires all of us to change that. So there's a few trends and realities worth noting and places where your organizations can start to build communities for your donors. So we've seen the rise of mutual aid. It has always been around, but we've seen it become more public this year because of technology. So we have St. Louis COVID Mutual Aid. We have the Sweet and Mutual Aid Fund that supports the transgender community in St. Louis. Google both of those. That is essentially funds that are organized where I, as an individual, give my money, and that money is dispersed to other individuals who need to pay their rent, who need to pay their bills, who need to pay for their medicine every month. Sometimes mutual aid is organized in a way that you can get a tax acknowledgement letter for it, and sometimes mutual aid is just giving money to someone else to help them. And it does not come with any sort of governmental oversight or strings attached to it. Technology is starting to play a much bigger part in giving. We've known that for a long time. We still have organizations that are trying to figure out how to set up a Facebook fundraiser. I'm going to need you to do that by Giving Tuesday. So go to the Giving Tuesday website, download all their collateral, go to Facebook, take the webinar, but you need to know how to set up a Facebook fundraiser. We've started to see giving circles and participatory grant making arise again. We've started to see organizations figure out what their advocacy platform is, how they are moving from harm reduction to a space of systems change. I mentioned our Trump bump before. So the Trump bump is interesting. And it exists in a way that the sort of more successful Trump was at pushing his agenda, the more likely donors were to give to causes that worked against pieces of those agenda. What is true also, though, is that the Trump bump did not mirror that effect in organizations that aligned with Trump's agenda. So Trump's core, organizations, causes, whatever, the NRA, for example, didn't see a massive influx of resources as Trump advanced his agenda. So that is just something interesting to consider. And then we look at an abundance mindset. Nonprofits tend to exist in a silo. And over the course of the last 2 years or so, we've started to see more collaboration. We've started to see nonprofits saying, like, it's great if you fund us, but like, we can't be successful unless they're successful, or we can't do this work without you funding their report. And so we've started to see collaborations of nonprofits and funders come together to solve problems. So you can see that happening through the Flourish initiative, through Generate Health and the Missouri Foundation for Health. You can see that happening in the Racial Healing and Justice Fund, which is Ford through Ferguson, along with the Deaconess Foundation and MFH and a bunch of other community funders. But we're starting to see this work happen a little bit differently. So where do we go from here? Organizational culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I just dumped a lot of information on you, and you have to want to do something with it to bring change to your organization. And there are a million reasons why you might not want to change, right? My board is helpful. My board is not helpful. My board won't listen. Our donors don't understand. Our staff doesn't like to learn new ways of doing things. We did a strategic plan. It doesn't have this in it. We don't have a strategic plan. I'm succession planning. I can't start this. We're in a pandemic. There's a million reasons why, or I shouldn't even say reasons. I will say excuses, why we wouldn't be interested in changing. But what I can tell you very clearly, I've been in this world for almost 20 years, is that you can't raise money like you've raised it before. And I think we've heard that adage that doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. So we have an opportunity to change, and everybody's in the same place, so you're not alone. And there are some ways to think about how you do that. So you have to be able to look at your organization and figure out where some of these pieces of white supremacy history and culture that I've talked about show up in your organization, show up in the way you interact with your stakeholders. What is working? What is not working? What is keeping you in a place of harm reduction versus a place of changing the system that you're working in? Embrace a process of innovation that requires asking a lot of questions and doing a lot of listening. So have the conversation, invite your funders for a roundtable, invite your donors for a roundtable, invite people who stopped giving to a roundtable. If you have a Zoom account or Microsoft Office or whatever, this is easy now. We just have to make the commitment and hold the time to do it. Operate based on a set of core values and principles. Most organizations have them. Are you using them? Are you clear about how they show up in your work? And are you clear with your donors how this shows up in your work? Create a space for forgiving and healing. I don't buy into cancel culture. Cancel culture isn't going to change communities. Cancel culture isn't going to solve our problems. So we might have board members that don't get it. We might have staff that doesn't get it. We might not get it. Make a mistake. Make a mistake, fail, learn, try something new, invite somebody to the table who you don't even know if you want their opinion. Invite them anyway, because they might say something that is going to change the way that you were able to do this work. Build your village. Who are the people that are going to, in your organization, help you move some of this forward? Who's going to help you build relationships? Who's going to help you build a network of other organizations who align with the work that you're trying to do, who serve the same stakeholders, who have the same funders? How do we build collaborative partnerships where we are getting more money for our institutions and for our partner institutions, right, to do this work? And then pick a place and start. If your place to start is reading Winners Take All, or The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, or Decolonizing Wealth, start there. If your start is sitting down with your executive director or your board chair and talking about what's not working in fundraising, start there. If your starting place is convening conversations with your donors to learn about why they give to your organization and what they want to see, start there. But there isn't sort of, again, an option to continue doing what you're doing. And I think what we've seen, looking at the last year, is that we had a lot of organizations who thought they were doing donor-centered fundraising, who thought that they had enough of an operating reserve. And ultimately, I think when we go into 2021 and 2022, we're going to see either a lot of organizations closing their doors, or we are going to see a lot of organizations beginning to consider what a merger looks like. And that's really great and wonderful. And we need to figure out how to think about those resources differently. So I am done talking at you, and I think we have some time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I think. And I'm going to hang out, and you can ask questions or ask me about fundraising stuff I didn't talk about. Whatever makes your little hearts happy. It's also really sad that I can't see you guys, because I kind of feel like I'm having a conversation with myself. Is there anything else you want to hear more about? Yay, hi Michelle, I'm glad you're here. Okay, Okay, in what way are folks developing relationships when face-to-face meetings aren't possible? Okay, so I think that there's a couple ways that we've seen this happening. So yes, I know we like hate Zoom and hate all these digital platforms, but we need to figure out how to use them, and we need to use them in a way that keeps us connected with our donors. So you can do that one-on-one, right? But for a lot of our organizations, some of our best donors are not tech savvy. They are not going to get on Zoom. They're not going to, figure out how to use their Google Chat, even if they have a Gmail. And so you're going to have to start picking up the phone. Like, I remember a time maybe like 5 or 10 years ago where we were like, phone banking is dead. Like, why are people calling me to ask me for money? Y'all, that's going to come back this year or next year. If you do not have a telephone option or a text to give option in your year-end appeal or in your plans for next year, you need to figure that out. You absolutely need to figure out what of your board members are good at reading from a script and who you can give that year-end script to and have them hop on their phone and spend an hour making phone calls. And help people who are your best fundraising volunteers, like arm them with the language they need to walk your donors through making their gifts online. I would say the same thing about paper appeals, right? We're used to our mailing lists, we're used to mailing a letter. There was a period of time where you could have just sent those letters to your sort of Gen X, boomer donors, and they would have responded with a paper envelope. You're going to want to send those to a larger group of people this year, because the other thing that's happening is when people are burnt out and they're spending less time on their devices, they're not reading your email and newsletter appeals. They are not seeing your fundraisers or your GoFundMes. So we have to kick it old school a little bit, and we have to be okay with that. So I hope that that is helpful. Phone calls. I hate phone calls, and I'm going to be making so many phone calls in December to ask people for money. Okay, can you say a little bit more about examples of how organizations who share funders can come together to strengthen and grow a shared relationship? Yeah, so I would say a couple things. The first thing is that all of the organizations, let's say we have 4 or 5 nonprofits that are getting together, we have to sort of understand what our baseline is, what the rules for engagement are. So oftentimes, I've seen this happen over and over in St. Louis. There'll be a national grant opportunity. All of these organizations will be like, I'm going to lead this and I'm going to invite my partners. And then the invited partners were like, no, we were going to lead this, right? And at the end of the day, we either don't submit the ask, or we submit like 10 asks and none of them are funded, or we don't submit anything because we like can't get it together. And so when you decide to pursue a collaborative opportunity for funding with one funder or a group of funders, you all have to start by establishing your own rules of engagement. The next thing that I would say is to embrace an abundance mindset, right? So maybe it's that you are in a space where you are well-funded, right? Is it possible that your organization could continue growing, continue achieving its level of success if you say, you know what, in this scenario, we really need this partner organization to get an extra $25,000 because they have to do X, Y, and Z for us to be able to do A, B, and C. How do we create a bigger picture, right, for our peers to look at and for funders to look at? And then you need to invite your funders into the conversation. So oftentimes in this region and across philanthropy, you'll have a funder driving conversations about collaboration, and everybody jumps to do what the funder wants you to do because the funder has the money and the funder has the power. And then as nonprofits, we can't get on the same page. You have an opportunity to get on the same page first. Don't wait. Don't wait for the RFP. Don't wait for the grant application to open. Have a conversation with your peers, develop a proposal, and then take that to your funder, take that to your group of funders and say, here's what we need. Here's what our community says we need. How can you show up in this way? and have a conversation about it. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen, it might not happen in 6 months. But what is true is that our funders in this region talk to each other in many different ways all the time, and they're trying to figure out how to meet us where they are. We have to stop trying to align our work to the way that their applications tell us they need to get stuff from us, and we need to start being honest with them about what we need. Okay. I think there was one more question over here, but now it's disappeared. How do I figure out where it went? Michelle, I think you said something about event strategy. So I'm gonna see if I can answer that question. Okay, so maybe some of you have done virtual events this year. A virtual event is not taking your gala or your trivia night and putting it online. So if that's your idea, go dump it in the dumpster that's on fire outside, because that's not what a virtual event is. When you think about engaging people in a virtual event and building the funds raised from that, right? You may still have event sponsors. That's fine. You're still going to have your event sponsors, but getting people to come and participate in your event and give in your event looks different than getting them drunk at a party and then having them buy the puppy, right? Like we're not selling puppies anymore. And also just don't sell puppies. Side note. Okay. So I think that we have to have shorter windows of time, right? So when we look at virtual fundraisers, let's talk about an hour and 15 minutes. Let's talk about what are the opportunities for your audience to network with each other or to connect with people that they used to see in person all the time that they may not see at all anymore, right? So actually this platform is really great for that, right? You come in, you sit at a table, you get to talk to people who maybe you've never met before, right? So create an opportunity for your supporters to build relationships with each other. You need to be super clear with what the purpose of the event is. You need to be clear about your goal. You need to be clear about who is there. If you are honoring someone, you still need to do awards and an award presentation and videos and all that stuff. But also the way that you are asking looks different. And so we've had a couple clients this year who have had to pivot their fundraisers to online events. And so, we did our porch drops like this. We had our swag bags. We also sent emails, personal emails from the executive director to every single person that hadn't registered for the event, if it was something that had happened in the past. And the response from a personal email was huge. So an e-blast, a Facebook event, that stuff is not going to get you there with virtual events anymore, unless there's something super exciting that's happening. It really is your donors and your supporters actually feeling connected to your organization and wanting to spend an hour of their time in front of another Zoom. I have seen a couple pretty successful fundraisers that have happened outside. But I will say this requires you to work within the limits of your given municipality. So one of our clients, St. Louis Youth Jobs, back at the beginning of October, they did a small fundraiser. They could have a maximum of 50 people in Shaw Park. There was live music. Everyone had their own boxed meals. Everyone could text to give. That was a really exciting thing for them. And so I think that we will also start to see as we go into 2021, don't fool yourself. We are still probably not going to be gathering in gala-sized groups, right? That we're going to start to see these smaller fundraisers happening. We're going to start to see these sort of smaller and shorter fundraising events happening. And we're going to start to see these sort of outdoor, small, sort of boutique engagements start to happen, which I think do at the end of the day give us the opportunity to better connect with our donors and really understand why they're supporting our organization. I think we have a couple minutes left, so I will just ask if there's one more burning question